At 10:22 a.m. on September 15, 1963, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 young girls were killed, 20 or so people inside were injured, and the country was changed forever. Prior to 2001, only one of the men responsible for the bombing, Robert Chambliss, was brought to justice, and it was the testimony of a trans man that helped send him to prison. The testimony of his nephew, Pete Smith. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian who talks about queer history on the internet. Just a note that I will be using Pete's dead name in addition to his real name because he himself used both when discussing the bombing and his testimony. He didn't transition until after the trial, and history largely remembers him as the Reverend Elizabeth H. Cobbs. Petric J. Smith, known as Pete to his friends, was born as Elizabeth Ann Hollifield in Birmingham, Alabama in April of 1940. Smith came from a large and close-knit family. His mother had 6 sisters, most of whom were married with children of their own, and he spent his early childhood living with his grandmother, his mother, 2 of his aunts, and several cousins while all of the men were off fighting World War II. His Uncle Bob, however, was too old to be drafted. He was 36 in 1940, so he was a major figure in Smith's childhood. Smith's first memories of his uncle are of being taunted for being a tomboy and of being afraid. Smith describes Chambliss as the type of man that you learn to be still and quiet around, and to whom you did not, under any circumstances, show fear or uncertainty. Smith's uncle had a hair-trigger temper, a chip on his shoulder, and a violent hatred for everyone and everything that threatened the so-called Southern way of life. So it's perhaps not a surprise to learn that he was an active and enthusiastic member of his local K-Cubed chapter. He took Smith to his first cross-burning barbecue when Smith was only 9. By 1963, Chambliss had earned the nickname Dynamite Bob for his work with a splinter group called the Cahaba Boys, who believed that the K-Cubed were being too restrained in their response to desegregation. The members of this secretive group were responsible for dozens of increasingly violent attacks around Birmingham starting in the 1950s. Pete Smith, meanwhile, was a 23-year-old single parent earning $1.10 an hour working at a department store in Birmingham in 1963. After his family crushed his dreams of attending college, he dropped out of high school at 16 and eloped with his boyfriend. He gave birth to a son named Robin the next year, but his husband became physically and mentally abusive, so Smith left him and moved back in with his family. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church didn't happen in a vacuum, and there are other historians on TikTok who are much better equipped to give you the full context. But it was the culmination of decades of escalating racial tensions that boiled over when 3 of Birmingham's schools were integrated on September 4th, 1963. Chambliss was enraged both by the integration of the schools and by what he saw as federal overreach in forcing the issue. The night before the bombing, he remarked to Smith, "Just wait till after Sunday morning and they will beg us to let them segregate." Smith said that when news of the bombing broke, he knew in his gut that his uncle was involved. The FBI was called in to investigate almost immediately, both because of the magnitude of the crime and because there was strong evidence that members of the police department had been involved in it, including one of Smith's cousins, who was a Birmingham police officer. Smith's first meeting with the FBI was in the parking lot of an insurance company, hidden from view. It had been arranged by a woman who's known only to history by her pseudonym, Dale Tarrant. Tarrant and Smith were part of a small network of women with ties to the K-Cubed, whose work as witnesses and informants was crucial to the investigation and to Chambliss's eventual conviction. I say that Smith was part of a network of women not to deny his identity, but because at the time he was existing in the world as a woman, specifically a young, single, mostly powerless woman who was providing evidence against a family member. Smith and Tarrant in particular were key to getting information from Chambliss's wife Flora to the FBI. Chambliss died without ever knowing that his wife helped send him to prison. The FBI investigation formally named 4 people, including Chambliss, as the likely perpetrators of the bombing, but no charges were ever filed. The federal case was closed in 1968 and the files sealed by order of J. Edgar Hoover. William Baxley reopened the case as soon as he was elected Attorney General of Alabama in 1971. He then spent 5 years fighting with the FBI to get the evidence that they'd collected as part of their initial investigation. He didn't get it until he threatened to hold a press conference in which the parents of the slain girls would accuse the FBI of protecting their killers. After the first investigation came to nothing, Smith tried to move on with his life. He remarried, became a real estate agent, and in 1977 was ordained as a Methodist minister. When a state investigator reached out to Smith to tell him that the case against his uncle was being reopened, he agreed to help. Chambliss was finally indicted and went to trial for the murder of Denise McNair in November of 1977. Smith's testimony was a surprise. He'd been kept off the witness list for his own safety and didn't arrive to the courthouse until it was time for him to take the stand. He testified for hours, the prosecution and defense going back and forth 9 times before they finally rested. When he left the courthouse, Smith went immediately into hiding. Chambliss was free on bond, so he was going home every night. Smith had to stay secluded until the trial was over and the verdict had been read. Chambliss was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, but after the trial, Smith faced so much harassment, including threats to bomb the church where he preached, that his marriage fell apart and he was driven out of Birmingham. The K-Cubed kept finding him, though, even after he spent 2 years undergoing gender reassignment treatment and was declared of the male gender by a Texas court in 1981. Fun fact, when choosing his new name, Pete took Justice as his middle name. Chambliss died in prison in 1985, and Smith returned to Birmingham shortly thereafter, devoting the rest of his life to activism, specifically women's rights, racial equality, and queer rights. He was even one of the organizers of Birmingham's very first Pride Parade, that's him in the hat, holding the banner, which was celebrated in 1989 to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. He wrote a memoir in 1996 that is no longer in print, but has been made available online for free by his estate. Petric Justice Smith died of lung cancer in 1998. He was just 57 years old. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.